There is a moment in a man's life when he begins to see what others don't, and that moment is far more dangerous than he realizes. It does not feel like an achievement, nor a celebration of sharpened awareness. It feels like a shift, subtle but irreversible, where the world that once looked ordinary begins to reveal its fractures, its hidden tensions, its unspoken motives. A man thinks he has gained insight, but what he has really gained is exposure to a layer of truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What he thought was intelligence becomes something else entirely, a weapon he never asked to carry. And once it is drawn, the world reacts differently to him, not with admiration but with unease, as though the simple act of seeing clearly is an offense against those who prefer the shelter of illusion. It begins quietly. He notices the hesitation behind someone's smile, the subtle delay before a lie, the way two people glance at each other a moment too long. He observes the gap between what people claim to value and what they choose when no one is watching. These observations collect like small stones in his mind, piling into patterns. And in these patterns, he sees human nature with an accuracy that most would call unsettling. It is not that others are blind, it is that they have trained themselves not to look too closely. They move through life as if details are irrelevant and motives are accidental. But the man who sees beneath the surface knows better. He sees intention where others see coincidence. He sees power where others see personality. He sees strategy where others see emotion. This clarity does not elevate him, it separates him. What most people call intuition is nothing more than their mind brushing against truth for a brief second before retreating. But the man who keeps looking, who refuses to retreat, becomes something else. He becomes the one who steps into a room and immediately feels the hierarchy, the alliances, the hidden resentments. He can sense when someone is performing kindness or negotiating for advantage. He can tell when a friend is drifting, when a competitor feels threatened, when an ally is secretly calculating. These perceptions give him leverage, but they also mark him as different. People do not need to know what he sees, they simply feel it. They feel watched, even when he says nothing. They feel exposed, even when he is silent. They feel that he understands them in ways they wished he didn't. And this makes them react not with gratitude for his insight, but with quiet suspicion. The world is designed for those who follow, not for those who observe. Society prefers men who accept things at face value, who believe what they are told, who move along predictable paths. The observer violates this contract. He is not fooled by polite gestures or dramatic displays. He does not mistake volume for confidence or charm for loyalty. He sees the machinery behind people's actions, the self-interest that guides them, the insecurities that shape them. And because he sees this, he cannot be manipulated in the same way others can. This is precisely why people begin to consider him dangerous. Not because he acts against them, but because he cannot be handled like the rest. They sense that their usual tricks do not work on him, that their narratives crumble in his presence, that their masks feel thin when he is in the room. His clarity becomes a silent rebellion against the social order. There is a peculiar tension that forms once a man begins to see too deeply. The illusions that once comforted him begin to disintegrate. The excuses people hide behind no longer sound convincing. The rituals and performances that define social life appear hollow. He realizes that many conflicts are not about principle, but about ego. Many relationships are not about loyalty, but convenience. Many successes are not about merit, but manipulation. This understanding does not make him cynical, it makes him awake. But awakening has a cost. Ignorance allowed him to participate in life without questioning its structure. Awareness forces him to confront the architecture of deception that holds everything together. And once he sees it, he cannot unsee it. The first danger reveals itself here. Once a man sees truth, he loses the comfort of illusion. He can no longer pretend that people mean what they say, or that their intentions are pure simply because they present them that way. The world becomes sharper, harsher, more honest. Certainty dissolves. Trust becomes more earned, less assumed. Naivety dies. This transformation creates a distance between him and others, even those he once felt close to. They continue living in the narratives that keep them sane. He, on the other hand, recognizes the cracks in those narratives. And there is an unspoken rule in human society. Those who expose illusions, even silently, are treated as threats. People begin to behave differently around him without understanding why. They grow guarded. They hesitate before speaking. They avoid meeting his eyes for too long, as if he might see something they do not want seen. He has not changed his demeanor, he has changed his depth, and depth, by its nature, intimidates the shallow. They feel as though his perception gives him an advantage, even if he chooses not to use it. They feel as though he can read their weaknesses, even if he never mentions them. They feel as though he is too aware, too controlled, too perceptive. In a world built on pretense, genuine clarity becomes an act of defiance. This is why most men instinctively choose ignorance. Reality, when seen clearly, is heavy. It demands responsibility. It demands strength. It demands that a man govern himself rather than be governed by the lies that comfort others. The man who sees too much is forced into adulthood, while the rest remain in their chosen innocence. But he cannot return to the man he was before. Once the mind expands beyond illusion, it cannot shrink back into it, and this alone separates him from the herd, not superiority, but capacity. He carries a weight they do not even realize exists. And yet, the moment he begins to see what others don't, is only the beginning of the danger. Because clarity does not merely distance him from the world, it changes how the world treats him. And the first consequence of this sharpened perception is something he does not expect at all, something that waits for him as the next unavoidable step. There comes a point when heightened perception stops feeling like a private advantage and begins to reshape your entire relationship with the world. You notice it when conversations feel thinner than they used to, when people's excuses strike you as rehearsed, when the emotions they display do not match the motives they hide. You begin to see that most interactions are not exchanges of truth, but exchanges of masks. And the moment you realize this, you step into a different category of human being, one that others cannot fully trust, because they sense you will not participate in the same illusions that keep them comfortable. This is where the isolation begins, not as a dramatic exile, but as a gradual emotional distancing, as if the world itself takes a step back from you to protect its own fragility. It is not that you withdraw first. In fact, the initial instinct of a perceptive man is often to stay close, to understand others more deeply, to connect with greater honesty. But the clearer you see, the more others sense something in you that they cannot name. They feel observed, even if you speak gently. They feel decoded, even if you never confront them. They feel their own contradictions reflected back at them, not through your words, but through the calm, unshakable way you notice. And when someone feels seen beyond their performance, they instinctively protect themselves. They close off. They retreat. They keep you at arm's length, not because of anything you've done, but because your presence disrupts the stories they rely on to feel safe. You become the mirror they would prefer to avoid. People do not fear the man who is loud, or dramatic, or openly confrontational. They know how to handle those types. What they fear is the man whose silence carries weight, the one who studies before he speaks, the one who asks a single question that cuts deeper than 10 accusations. That man unsettles them. That man forces them to confront themselves, even briefly. And so they respond with suspicion disguised as politeness, with distance disguised as respect, with avoidance disguised as busyness. They tell themselves, he's just quiet, or he's intense, or he thinks too deeply. But beneath these labels is a quiet discomfort, the feeling that he sees more than he should. This separation intensifies when you realize how differently you process reality compared to those around you. While others take words at face value, you sense the intent beneath them. While they are distracted by tone, you focus on motive. While they judge what someone shows, you analyze what someone hides. This difference in perception creates a difference in experience. Others move through life with a kind of social autopilot. You move through it awake, and people can sense that you're awake in a way they are not, which makes them treat you as if you're dangerous, even when you've done nothing to threaten them. The danger they perceive is not in your actions, but in your awareness. The irony is that this separation feels unfair at first. You do not want to intimidate. You do not want to be misunderstood. You do not want to be alone in rooms full of people who believe they know you. But awareness is not a choice, it is a condition. And the more you see, the more you understand that most relationships depend heavily on shared blindness, the mutual agreement not to analyze too deeply, not to question motives too openly, not to notice the cracks in each other's stories. When one person abandons that pact, the dynamic shifts. You are no longer participating in the same emotional economy. You have stepped outside the boundaries of ordinary interaction, and those boundaries will now close behind you. Eventually, you experience a moment that marks the beginning of true isolation, when you try to express your insight to someone and watch their face tighten in fear, confusion, or denial. They might laugh it off. They might accuse you of overthinking. They might become defensive, insisting you're wrong even when you're right. What matters is not their reaction, but the realization it gives you. Most people do not want truth, they want agreement. And because you see too clearly to offer empty agreement, you become someone they cannot fully welcome. They will keep you near enough to benefit from your stability, but far enough that your clarity doesn't expose them. As your perception deepens, you begin to sense the isolation before it even arrives. The pauses in conversation grow longer. The energy around you becomes cautious. People share less. They confide less. They reveal less. They treat you as though you live on the edge of their trust rather than at the center of it. And this is the moment you understand the true cost of seeing what others don't. Insight sets you apart, not through superiority, but through incompatibility. You can no longer engage with the world the way it wishes to be engaged with. You can no longer pretend not to notice. You can no longer return to simplicity. But isolation is not the worst consequence of deeper perception. There is something far more threatening waiting behind it, something that emerges the moment your awareness begins to challenge not just individuals, but the systems they depend on. Because when a man sees too clearly, the world does not simply distance itself from him, it begins to treat him as a danger. And the reason for that shift is far more primal than most people would admit. There comes a moment when isolation stops being a passive consequence and becomes an active signal, a signal that the world has begun to identify you as a threat, not because you have done anything hostile, but because your perception is sharp enough to destabilize the comfortable illusions people rely on. The truth is simple and brutal. A man who sees too much is dangerous, not for what he does, but for what he could do. Awareness alone becomes a form of silent power, and power, even in its quietest form, evokes fear. This is when the world shifts from avoiding you to defending itself against you, as though your clarity has become a weapon aimed in their direction. People fear being understood more than they fear being judged. Judgment can be dismissed, argued with, or ignored. But to be understood, truly understood, is exposure. It strips away the narrative they use to justify their actions. It reveals the insecurities they hide beneath arrogance. It uncovers the envy they disguise as advice. It exposes the manipulation they excuse as care. When people sense that you can see through these disguises, they instinctively treat you as someone who must be kept at a distance. They may smile, but the smile is tense. They may speak, but the words are filtered. They may act friendly, but the warmth is measured. You become someone they tiptoe around, because they know you can read the subtext of their behavior better than they can maintain it. In every social structure, families, friend circles, classrooms, workplaces, there is an unspoken hierarchy held together, not by strength, but by shared delusion. People agree, without ever saying it aloud, to pretend certain truths do not exist. They pretend weakness is confidence. They pretend insecurity is humility. They pretend gossip is concern. They pretend envy is admiration. And anyone who sees the truth behind these performances becomes a threat to the emotional ecosystem that keeps the group stable. You disrupt the balance simply by perceiving what others refuse to acknowledge. They may not be conscious of it, but on an instinctive level, they feel that your presence destabilizes their carefully constructed world. This is why people begin to react defensively, even when you make no accusation. They grow irritated by your silence. They misinterpret your questions as attacks. They sense hostility where there is none. A perceptive man does not need to confront anyone to provoke fear. His clarity alone forces people to confront themselves. And self-confrontation is something most individuals would rather avoid. In their minds, the danger is not that you will expose them to others, but that you will expose them to themselves. They fear the reflection you create simply by existing with your eyes open. This fear intensifies when your insights begin to threaten not just individuals, but collective illusions. Systems, whether social, political, or personal, depend on predictable participants. Those who think independently disrupt the order. Those who notice patterns disrupt control. Those who question motives disrupt obedience. The perceptive man threatens the mechanisms that rely on conformity, silence, and blindness. Authority, whether small or immense, does not fear rebels who shout. It fears observers who understand. Those who understand can predict. Those who predict can adapt. Those who adapt cannot be controlled. and a man who cannot be controlled is the one every system quietly fears. The threat you pose is not rooted in aggression, but in unpredictability. When people cannot manipulate your emotions, they cannot steer your choices. When they cannot deceive you, they cannot anticipate your reactions. When they cannot confuse you, they cannot contain you. This lack of control makes even the most confident individuals anxious. They begin to interpret your neutrality as danger, your restraint as strategy, your silence as suspicion. And in their panic, they respond with subtle hostility, the kind that does not announce itself, but that accumulates slowly through coldness, exclusion, gossip, and quiet attempts to undermine your influence. You may notice people joining together in opposition, even if you've done nothing to provoke it. Groups form around shared narratives. And when someone sees through those narratives, the group instinctively tries to defend itself. They will call you distant, untrustworthy, arrogant, intimidating. They will create stories that justify their discomfort. These labels protect them from the truth, that your perception reveals the parts of themselves they would rather keep hidden. To preserve their self-image, they must turn you into the problem. It is easier to demonize what threatens them than to examine why they feel threatened in the first place. And the deeper your awareness grows, the more the world responds not with distance, but with resistance. It challenges you, it tests you, it tries to break the clarity that makes you so difficult to control, because there is a final truth that every perceptive man eventually learns. Those who see too much in a world built on illusion are treated not as assets, but as dangers. And that danger becomes heavier, more personal, and far more psychologically costly when the burden of awareness begins to turn inward, revealing that the greatest threat does not always come from others, but from what your own mind is forced to confront next. There comes a point when the threat no longer comes from the outside world, but from within your own mind. Not because you are weak, but because awareness carries a weight the unperceptive will never understand. The more you see, the more you are forced to confront truths that others never have to face. You begin to realize that perception is not just a weapon, it is a burden, one that isolates you not only from others, but from the simplicity you once enjoyed. You start to feel the cost of clarity in places you didn't expect, in your thoughts, in your relationships, in your ability to rest. The world becomes sharper, but so does its darkness. Patterns become clearer, but so do the consequences. And the truths you uncover begin to shape not only how you see others, but how you see yourself. Awareness forces you into a constant state of interpretation. When someone speaks, you hear more than their words. You hear the insecurity behind their confidence, the fear behind their anger, the calculation behind their kindness. You detect motives before they form into actions. You sense shifts in energy long before anyone else notices them. At first, this feels like an advantage, but over time, it becomes exhausting. Every room becomes a study. Every interaction becomes an analysis. Every silence becomes a signal. You cannot simply exist, you must interpret. This constant awareness turns life into something that feels more like strategy than presence. It sharpens you, yes, but it also wears you down. The burden grows heavier when you realize how often your insights reveal uncomfortable truths about the people you care for. You see a friend's jealousy before he admits it, even to himself. You notice a loved one's hidden resentment despite their forced smile. You recognize lies meant to protect your feelings, even when you wish you couldn't. This puts you in a dilemma with no escape. Either you confront what you see and risk conflict, or you stay silent and feel the weight of knowing. Most people never face this choice because they never see far enough to recognize it. But for you, it becomes part of daily existence, a quiet moral strain that others will never acknowledge, let alone understand. Self-awareness becomes the heaviest burden of all. When you see others with clarity, you inevitably begin to see yourself the same way. The illusions you once used for comfort begin to collapse. You recognize your own patterns, your own contradictions, your own weaknesses, your own strategies. You see the places where fear shaped your decisions. You see the moments where pride guided your tongue. You see the instincts you hide, the motives you deny, the ambitions you subtly disguise as virtue. This is the part of perception no one warns you about. The mirror turns back on you. And when it does, you are forced into a kind of internal honesty that is both powerful and merciless. This awareness strips you of excuses. You can no longer blame circumstances for patterns you now recognize as your own. You cannot claim ignorance to justify your actions. You cannot hide behind the comfort of not knowing. Clarity demands accountability. It demands that you examine yourself with the same scrutiny you apply to others. And this is where many perceptive men begin to feel the psychological pressure that separates them from the world. While others soothe themselves with comforting narratives, you are left with truth, raw, unfiltered, undeniable. It pushes you to grow, but it also isolates you from the emotional shortcuts others use to survive. The solitude deepens when you realize something even more unsettling. The more aware you become, the less relatable you become. People bond over shared confusion, shared naivety, shared blindness. They bond over misunderstandings they laugh about, over lies they both agree to accept, over illusions they maintain together. But when you see too much, you cannot participate in these rituals. You cannot pretend to misunderstand something you see clearly. You cannot laugh at what you know is manipulation. You cannot blindly trust what you have already analyzed. This separation is not chosen, it is inevitable. Your mind simply operates at a depth that others do not venture into, and this depth becomes a silent barrier between you and the world. Over time, the burden transforms into a kind of quiet fatigue. Not depression, not despair, just an awareness that clarity costs energy. You begin to understand why so many people opt for distraction, why they drown themselves in noise, why they crave simplicity. They are not weak, they are protecting themselves from the weight you now carry. And you, who cannot unsee, must carry it alone. The mind becomes sharper, but the heart becomes heavier. The world becomes clearer, but comfort becomes rarer. This is the price of seeing too much. You gain understanding, but you lose innocence. You gain insight, but you lose ease. You gain vision, but you lose the right to pretend. And yet, even this is not the final cost. Because there comes a moment when the burden you carry begins to transform into something else. Something the world fears even more than your awareness. A moment when perception stops simply revealing truth and starts granting a different kind of power. One that changes how you move, how you think, and how you influence the people around you. And it is in that transformation that the true danger begins. There comes a moment when the burden of perception begins to shift. It does not lighten, and it does not disappear. Instead, it sharpens into something far more defined, something that others can feel even if they cannot explain it. The weight you carried in silence becomes a form of presence. The awareness that once drained you begins to condense into influence. Those who see the world as it is, not as they wish it to be, eventually develop an ability that feels almost supernatural to those who remain trapped in illusion. Patterns reveal themselves before they happen. Motives unfold before they are spoken. People's intentions become readable long before they act on them. What once felt like a burden now becomes a source of quiet power. This power does not come from manipulation or dominance. It comes from understanding. When you can see the forces that shape behavior, you can predict outcomes more accurately than those who depend on emotion or projection. This prediction creates control, because a man who can anticipate the moves of others is never caught unprepared. He knows when someone is lying, even if they never slip. He senses when an alliance is forming long before words are exchanged. He sees ambition rising in someone who has not yet realized it himself. This foresight allows him to position himself strategically, not aggressively, not loudly, but with a calm precision that others mistake for luck or confidence. The world responds differently to a man who carries this kind of clarity. People may not know what he sees, but they feel the result. They notice that he does not panic when they panic. He does not flinch when tensions rise. He does not reveal emotion when others lose control. His neutrality becomes a shield. His restraint becomes a signal. His silence begins to carry more influence than another man's persuasion. In groups, he becomes the one people watch before reacting. They study his stillness, hoping to understand what he understands. Without trying, he becomes a reference point, someone whose presence shapes the behavior of others simply by refusing to be moved. This is the strategic advantage of perception. You gain leverage without exerting force. You become powerful without demanding power. You influence outcomes without raising your voice. When people sense that you see deeply, they adjust themselves around you. They modify their lies to avoid being exposed. They strengthen their arguments to avoid appearing foolish. They choose their words more carefully, afraid of revealing too much. Your awareness becomes a gravitational pull, shifting the balance of every interaction. Those who once underestimated you begin to tread cautiously. Those who once dismissed you begin to observe you more closely. And those who once tried to manipulate you realize quickly that the weapons they use on others do not work on you. With this comes another layer of power, the ability to remain unaffected. Most people are controlled by their emotional reactions. Their decisions come from impulse rather than intention. But when you see the mechanisms behind human behavior, the fears, the insecurities, the ego traps, you stop reacting. You detach. And that detachment terrifies people who rely on emotional chaos to gain control. They do not know how to handle someone who cannot be provoked, someone whose stillness dismantles their attempts at manipulation. This emotional invulnerability becomes a form of dominance that does not resemble aggression but feels stronger than it. You begin to understand the flow of influence in conversations. You can sense when someone is trying to assert superiority, and you let them, knowing their need for power exposes their insecurity. You can feel when someone is hiding something, and you wait, knowing silence reveals more than confrontation. You can detect when a person tries to shift blame or twist facts, and you remain calm, knowing their tactic collapses when it fails to affect you. This mastery is subtle. It is invisible. It is the type of power that does not need to announce itself, because the results speak without explanation. But the greatest power of all is the ability to guide without force. When you see what others don't, you can influence them by appealing to motives they don't even recognize in themselves. You can encourage someone by feeding their unspoken ambition. You can calm someone by addressing the fear beneath their anger. You can redirect conflict by exposing the real issue without humiliating the person involved. You can shape decisions, behaviors, and outcomes not through pressure, but through understanding. This is the kind of influence that reshapes rooms, relationships, and even structures, the influence of a man who perceives deeply and chooses strategically. Yet this power is not without its risks. For the moment you begin to wield perception as influence, the world starts to react with a different kind of fear, not the fear of being seen, but the fear of what you might become. When people sense that you can shape outcomes without revealing your hand, they grow wary. They begin to question your intentions, even when you have none. They interpret your calm as calculation. They mistake your observation for manipulation. They assume strategy in every word you speak, because they cannot understand someone who sees so clearly without seeking control. And it is here, at the height of your perceptive power, that the final danger emerges. A danger far more destructive than isolation, fear, or misunderstanding. It is the point where your insight, your clarity, and your ability to influence begin to provoke forces that do not tolerate men who cannot be controlled. And the consequences of that shift are far more perilous than anything you've faced so far. There comes a moment when perception crosses a final threshold, a point where seeing too much no longer isolates you, no longer merely threatens those around you, no longer simply grants you influence. It becomes something far more dangerous. It turns you into a man the world cannot easily categorize, cannot manage, and cannot predict. And when a system cannot predict you, it begins to fear you in ways far deeper than individual suspicion or quiet resentment. You become a disruption to the very order that keeps people and institutions stable. The danger shifts from social discomfort to existential threat, not for you but for them. And that is precisely why the final risk emerges. A man who sees clearly becomes uncontrollable. He cannot be fooled by flattery because he sees the insecurity behind it. He cannot be manipulated by guilt because he recognizes the tactic. He cannot be guided by fear because he has already confronted truths far darker than the ones people try to use against him. This immunity, once developed, makes him immune to the simplest and most effective tools of control used by society. The perceptive man breaks the invisible chains that bind others, and in doing so, he becomes someone the world can no longer govern using its usual pressures. This is the kind of freedom that alarms those who depend on predictable followers. The final risk begins when people realize that they cannot influence your emotions the way they influence others. They cannot shame you because you see the manipulation behind the moral posturing. They cannot threaten you because you understand the weakness in their authority. They cannot deceive you because you see their motives before they articulate them. They cannot lure you with status, approval, or validation because you recognize that these rewards are tools of control, not signs of worth. When all these methods fail, the world reacts instinctively. It tries to contain what it cannot control. The containment begins subtly. People start creating narratives about you. They whisper that you are cold, arrogant, unfeeling, dangerous. They fear what they cannot read, so they distort it into something familiar. They recast your clarity as cruelty, your boundaries as hostility, your calm as emotional distance. These stories are not meant to describe you. They are meant to neutralize the power of your presence. If they can convince others that you are dangerous, they can lessen the threat you pose simply by shifting perception against you. This tactic is ancient. When you cannot defeat a man's insight, you discredit his character. But the greater risk comes when your clarity threatens structures rather than individuals. When someone in power realizes you see through their performance, they become defensive. When a group realizes you understand their hidden dynamics, they grow anxious. When a system, a workplace, a hierarchy, a social order senses that you recognize its inner mechanisms, it begins to push back. Because the perceptive man is not just independent, he is disruptive. He is the variable that cannot be predicted, the presence that cannot be controlled, the observer that cannot be blinded. And in any structure built on illusion, that kind of man is the greatest danger of all. The pressure intensifies when you stop merely seeing patterns and begin adapting to them with strategic precision. You move differently. You speak less, but with more impact. You react slowly, forcing others to reveal themselves before you respond. You position yourself where influence accumulates naturally. You remove yourself from situations designed to trap you. This strategic self-governance makes you untouchable in a way that infuriates those who rely on emotional leverage. They realize that you cannot be pulled into their chaos, and this lack of vulnerability feels like superiority, even if it is merely self-control. Humans instinctively attack what they cannot influence. Yet the greatest danger does not come from others at all. It comes from the crossroads that awareness eventually forces you to face. When you see too much, you must choose how to live with it. And this choice determines whether perception destroys you or frees you. If you use your insight to judge, you become bitter. If you use it to control, you become manipulative. If you use it to isolate, you become hollow. These are the paths that swallow perceptive men whole, not because they are weak, but because they lack direction. Perception gives clarity, but without purpose, clarity becomes torment. But if you choose differently, if you allow perception to refine rather than harden you, it transforms from a burden into a liberation. When you see the truth of human nature without resenting it, you stop expecting perfection from others. When you understand motives without condemning them, you navigate relationships without unnecessary conflict. When you recognize illusions without mocking them, you can live among people without losing yourself to their limitations. Perception becomes the tool that frees you from naivety, from manipulation, from self-deception. It becomes the foundation of sovereignty, the internal freedom that no authority can grant or take away. This is the final risk and the final reward. The world may treat you as a threat, but if you remain intact, if you refuse to use your awareness destructively, if you choose clarity over cynicism, you become something the world rarely produces, a man who cannot be controlled, but who also cannot be corrupted. A man who sees deeply, but does not collapse under the weight of what he sees. A man who understands others without losing compassion, who anticipates danger without becoming paranoid, who holds power without needing to display it. This kind of man is dangerous, not because he seeks to dominate, but because he cannot be dominated. And so the final truth reveals itself. The danger of seeing what others don't is real, but so is the freedom. Awareness will cost you comfort, but it will give you control. It will separate you from the herd, but it will return you to yourself. It will make you feared, but it will also make you unbreakable. The world may resist you, but it cannot stop you. Because once a man learns to see clearly, no force on earth can make him blind again. If you've made it this far, it's because a part of you already knows this truth. Seeing what others don't is not enlightenment, it is exile. The clearer your vision becomes, the further you drift from the crowd. Most people fear what they cannot understand, and they resent the one who understands too much. Now tell me in the comments, are you ready to live with the loneliness that comes with clarity? Are you willing to carry the burden of sight while everyone else chooses blindness? If this message touched you, if it made sense, write in the comments, I see what they don't. Let's see how many here are truly ready to carry the cost of perception. And don't forget, keep watching the next video. It's important, much more than you imagine. See you there.